You git! He yelled, as Dumbledore held him apart. It's got nothing to do with my family, as well you know. You knew full well what you were doing with Hen and where you were taking her. It was taking all of Dumbledore's strength to keep him from actually touching Snape. Severus had taken a few steps back, and looked startled. And where on earth do you get the idea that she would ever be interested in you? The young Sirius continued. She felt sorry for you, Snivellus, she told me. Don't you understand? There's no way in the House of Hades that she'd ever fancy you. You know she's a Mulborn, so there could only have been one thing on your mind. Cecilia saw Snape freeze. In fact, she thought she felt him freeze. Dumbledore's office suddenly felt a lot chillier, as if the windows had suddenly blown open. Then she heard Minerva, to the right of her this time, speak. Her voice echoed thin, as if being carried by the chill. Mr. Snape, you do admit you were in the company of Miss Edwards tonight, at the Shrieking Shack. Perhaps you could explain to the headmaster your intentions? Where you were going? Sirius was back on his feet now, and it was his turn to smirk, using it to his full advantage until he caught Minerva's gaze, and looked down. Snape said nothing. Mr. Snape, said Dumbledore eventually. His tone was severe. She'd not known Dumbledore speak like that before, and the effect was tortuous. She felt the urge to move out of its field, but could not move her feet. Miss Edwards' parents were murdered tonight by wizards unknown. However, the spell that killed them we do know. Avada Kedavra. Snape looked up urgently. Underneath his long hair, Cecilia could definitely detect fear. Sirius was also looking at Snape now, an expression of shock on his own. Mr. Snape, I will not ask you again. If you do not answer, I will have no alternative but to summon a Ministry error and you will be automatically under suspicion of conspiracy to murder. Why did you take Miss Edwards out of the castle grounds, to the Shrieking Shack, alone? She saw Sirius swallow, and mutter something. Dumbledore frowned. In that case, I was going to propose to her. He spat, glaring at Sirius. I thought I didn't know she was a Mulborn. He snapped into the air. He's lying! Screamed Sirius, turning to shout at Snape again. He was taking her there for them too. Is she all right? The voice came seemingly out of nowhere, but then Cecilia realized that it was Severus speaking now, low but soft. Henrietta Miss Edwards. How he coughed slightly. How is she? How is she taking the news? Miss Evans is with her, said Minerva slowly. She's in the hospital wing. Shock. Again, the scene melted away before Cecilia's eyes. The people became fuzzier. Her room came back into focus. Cecilia sat on the bed next to Minerva, contemplating the scenes she had just witnessed. Eventually, the witch spoke. Do you understand why I showed you those thoughts? Thoughts? Said Cecilia, almost to herself. Those were my memories, of almost 20 years ago. There is a lot of history between and amongst the wizards with whom you interact, Cecilia. You are aware, are you not, that Sirius was blamed for Harry's parents' murder, and spent almost 14 years of his life there? It was misinformation from Severus that led to his arrest. Cecilia nodded, then spoke. But Severus. He looked so. Cecilia still couldn't believe it. How could this young man, admittedly a bit geekish looking and probably quiet and not so outgoing, become the cold, forbidding, distant Severus Snape of today? Carefree? Young? Yes, nodded Minerva. That's just how he was. Admittedly his less than ideal associations with some in Slytherin house influenced him to a degree, but until that day, until Sirius Black accused him of foul play, I am convinced that's what he would have stayed. Cecilia nodded. Severus was never the charismatic young man like Sirius, but he was always kind and considerate to others, gave them second chances, treated them as equals, despite his personal feelings, favored the underdog. In the same way he's treated you, Cecilia, in an attempt to understand your science, for unselfish reasons. But even when his name was cleared, Sirius Black made sure everyone knew that he was about to propose to a Mulborn, more out of sport to see how Severus would react than concern over Henrietta Edwards. Up till then, he'd tolerated their taunts and tricks. But Sirius finally had him. He could not admit he had associations with a Mulborn wizard, denying it to the students in his house, of course, and that only led rumors to begin about other reasons he would be with Henrietta Edwards on the night her parents were murdered. And Sirius knew what he was doing, of course. The blacker side of Sirius Black, which you've also seen firsthand, Cecilia. That's what caused Severus to change from the boy you saw then to the man you know today. However, I do not believe the boy Severus has gone entirely, and that is some blessing. Are you trying to tell me that animosity between Severus and Sirius goes back a long way? I would have believed you, Minerva, without you having to show me. It's not just that, said Minerva carefully. Think again. Specifically Sirius's reaction when he knew Henrietta was missing, and Severus's reaction to her afterwards. Cecilia thought. Back to the first scene, where he was telling Minerva that Snape had gone off with her. Sirius wasn't concerned about her even after he found out about her parents' death until he was sure she was with Severus. And between them, even when Sirius had not only humiliated Snape by getting him to admit to something so personal, he continued to pour salt on his wounds. Yet despite all of that, Severus's main concern was Henrietta's welfare, despite knowing she was something other than what he'd expected her to be. And that was it, wasn't it? Sirius didn't actually want Henrietta for himself, but to antagonize Severus. For fun. He certainly didn't act like he cared about her well-being, and she probably fell for his looks and charm. Let's face it, what woman wouldn't? And Severus denied Henrietta, becoming bitter at Sirius's trick, being beguiled and tempted into the life of a Death Eater because he eventually came to believe what he was telling everyone else. The strangest thing, said Cecilia slowly, is that it isn't strange at all. It all makes total sense. It fits in with everything I already know about wizards in general, and those in particular. Blood mattered. And so did power. So was Henrietta all right? She added, changing the subject. I recognized the unforgivable spell. Her parents were victims of Voldemort, then? Yes, agreed Minerva. They were some of the first victims of the Death Eaters. The students you saw Sirius talking about became, in time, Death Eaters too. Now look again. This time, bright green haze before her eyes. Cecilia could see in the silver pool. Grass. Trees tall and high. Blue sky with the sun high. As before, she leaned further in and felt hair whooshing past her as she fell. Before her the grass beheld people. As she fell closer, she could see. A park. Ducks quacked on the pond adjacent. The sun warming Cecilia's back as it shone down. A happy day. She looked round as she swooped to a standing position for whom she would see this time. Around her, people were sat in groups, threes or so, either in benches, with small dogs on leads walking past. Children running and playing with toys. A lady in a fitted coat pushing a Silver Cross brand. Who would she see this time? Sirius again? Severus? Perhaps Lily or Henrietta? A young lady was walking over to one particular spot in the park, her full skirt blowing gently round her calves as she walked quickly towards. A young man. Cecilia noticed that she wore a sleeveless top with a wide collar, and a wide belt too, in dark green to match her skirt and sandals. She was quite fetching, thought Cecilia, not entirely beautiful, but striking. Something about her. Both the young lady and young man were very pleased to see one another, but there was an atmosphere of unease. Cecilia moved towards the pair, and as she drew closer, she noticed that the young lady was wearing a necklace. The pendant glinted in the sun. She'd seen it before. Minerva wore one just like it. The young couple were walking round the park now, Cecilia moving at a steady pace when they were in their sights, and she realized this must be Minerva when she was young. The 1950s perhaps. When children played with spinning tops in the park and skipping ropes. The image faded, and Cecilia was sitting next to Minerva again. Time passed before Minerva spoke. "Mickey was my first and last love," she said, a faraway look in her eyes. "We had been courting for almost 3 years. I'd decided to give up wizardry, to live as a respectable mole wife. Just after the Second World War there was a shortage of teachers, so I intended to remain at home as a governess." She glanced at Cecilia. "It was the done thing at the time. A married woman stayed at home to look after her husband. That was what I was going to do." She stopped. "Mickey," she continued after a few moments. "Michael Mullen. He worked repairing cars, and I met him during my work as an era. We fell in love, Cecilia. I was 29. You were going to give up your life as a wizard?" Cecilia nodded as she spoke. She knew the origin of that motivation. How her own mother had begged her not to marry Timothy Frobisher. How, if she were marrying because she was pregnant, her father and she would raise the child for her. How she pleaded with her not to give up on her dreams and hopes. How Cecilia had known that in spite of everything her mother said her words were in vain because of love. Because that was how her life was meant to be. Cecilia looked at Minerva's face. There was grief in her eyes, though hidden well. Cecilia recognized it because it was the same grief that had overcome her, not so very long ago. She waited for her to continue in her own time. "He understood about me being a witch, almost from the first day. There never seemed to be a problem. We just accepted it. It was part of us. But that day, in the park, he told me he would not be able to marry me, and he could not see me again." An age passed before the witch spoke again. "Do not let any of this," she gestured to Cecilia's now tidy room, "trouble you. You are intelligent, so I feel it is in your best interests to know something more of the relationship between moles and wizards, not least in helping you to understand your work. Moles and wizards may indeed be so similar, Cecilia, but equally we are so different." 88,888,888. "Harry told me," said Sirius, sitting with his legs up over the arm of his father's wing-backed chair. Remus Lupin was sitting in the chair next to him, but in a far more reserved position. He looked up at Sirius. "Are you serious? Is she okay?" "Who, Cecilia?" "Yes." "Fine. Spoke to her just now, in fact. Looks like it was probably Malfoy that broke in. Been winding her up all week." "Poor Cecilia." Remus unfolded his arms and walked over to the fireplace. "And you got to speak to her?" He sighed. "She's okay now?" "Had a good chat with Hogwarts' finest," said Sirius, casually. "The McGonagall," he clarified when Remus frowned. "Malfoy's got hold of your book, by the way, probably on its way to Uncle Lucius as we speak." "Well, I'm going to have to speak to her," said Remus, suddenly. "She is very protective over that book, you know, even more so after Biblion Flamore." He mimicked flames coming from the books on the shelf nearby. "She'll be frantic." "Relax, Moony." Sirius swung his legs from over the chair, and sat forward. "She didn't seem too worried when I spoke to her. And far too appropriately attired, he'd noticed, to his disappointment. Must be the McGonagall effect. Seemed quite cheerful, in fact." "To you," thought Remus, dully. "Perhaps I should speak to her. Anyway, You know that little weasel of a cousin of mine will hand it over to Snivellus first before it gets anywhere near Daddy Dearest. Ah yes, in the capable hands of Snivellus Snape. He looked distant for a while, grinning to himself, who in turn will either burn it, hide it or give it back to her. Look, he added at Remus's worried expression. She's got everything she needs from it, hasn't she? Even the story of the Lunar Men, which is, alas, no more. Actually, she did seem a little shocked to see me. Come to think of it, said Sirius, glancing down at her letter in his pocket. I wonder if it did shake her up more than she admitted. You wonder? Heavens, Padfoot, when did anyone ever talk to you about their insecurities? And that would be the first time she'd spoken to you since your error of judgment in August, would it? Besides, you know that's my job. The comforting arm, the oh I wish I could speak to Sirius the way I can to you, Remus line, before they went back and did exactly the same next week. Sirius chuckled. Yes, I don't seem to be able to do the big brother act in quite the same way as you, Moony. And prongs for the scintillating intellect, said Remus thoughtfully, as he paced across the once expensive, now moth-eaten carpet in Sirius's father's study. Not that it lasted long for prongs anyway, once Lily caught his eye. All the more ladies for you, eh? Remus winked, to show it was a joke. He had long since passed the stage of feeling insecure and in the shadow of his friend. Nevertheless, he hoped Sirius didn't detect the note of defensiveness that he himself could in his last comment. Anyway, you'll soon be able to talk to her when you and Tunks go home with her for her work. I don't know, wanting to protect my little cousin, eh? Sirius winked at Remus, who said nothing. If the book hasn't turned up then, at least Mrs. Frobisher can grovel to you in person about her careless loss. Is that what she said? More or less. She thinks it's her fault. Anyway, she seemed to have had a nice birthday. Sirius's voice trailed off as he stood up and walked over to the wall, ringing the bell pull that was hanging nearby from the ceiling. Where is that wretched creature with the tea? Oh, I suppose I'll have to magic some myself. He crossed back to the table, tutting a little. It's never the same as elf-made tea, he added, pointing his wand towards the table. Milk, Moony? Or wrong time of the month? Milk, confirmed Remus, sitting back down on the chair near the table. You were saying? Cecilia's birthday? Tunks had to cancel, so she stayed down in the Three Broomsticks for a while, before heading back to the castle. Quite a little adventure for her, so it seems. Coping with work and everything too. Sirius picked up a teacup and saucer, owing quietly at the refreshment. So you approve of her now? Of the research too? You realize what we were all trying to say to you? Remus looked over the rim of his cup, waiting for Sirius to reply before he took a sip. It's like you said, Moony, we all have to make some sacrifices. Now I know they're not playing around with blood, and that Harry's safe then, why not? She actually seems okay for a mole. No really my type though. He winked. Remus rolled his eyes, recalling a time when women like Cecilia were Sirius's type. See, said Remus. What did I tell you? Anyway, where'd you get to last Sunday? I thought Mr. Snuffles was going to keep me company. Sidetracked, said Sirius. Death Eaters. Didn't I tell you? Ended up in our tunnel by the Jolly Friar. Well, said Remus, conjuring a plate of biscuits. I really wish you hadn't. The Wolfspan was a bit weak, old batch, I think. I could really have done with the company. Sirius shrugged an apology, smiling weakly at his friend as much as to say, couldn't be helped. Shame we couldn't have caught up with Cecilia in the Three Broomsticks as she was there, thought Remus, aloud. Shame she had to spend the evening alone. So, are you going to let Cecilia know you and Tunks are her protectors, then? Said Sirius, changing the subject. I think I'll let Tunks do it. She's good at these things. Give Cecilia some breathing space. She's probably had the fill of wizards for 1 week. Sirius shifted to a more comfortable spot in his chair. Indeed. 88,888,888. Cecilia's mind was racing as it usually did once she'd finished one of her research sessions with Snape. They'd progressed a lot further on than she'd hoped that day, and despite still feeling the lethargy from the butterbeer had got worse, she'd managed to get a lot done. Energy was the subject of her investigation now. Question after question had arisen in her mind as they reasoned the DNA riddle. If wizard cells replicated, which they had to do, they needed energy. So did a wizard's energy come directly from their food in the same way as Muggle energy? Did the spells need activation energy? How was it manifest? How was it used? Question after question settled in her mind as she walked, and as she made her way to the library, the method by which they were going to solve it began to form. Just as she turned the corner to the corridor where the library lay, she bumped quite heavily into Hermione, almost knocking the little witch over. She helped Hermione pick up her books, then realized that she was crying. "Hermione?" she said, as Hermione stood hunched over the books Cecilia had handed back to her. "What's the matter?" N. She began, wiping at her face frantically. Cecilia patted her on her shoulders. "Oh, Mrs. Frobisher," she began again, before breaking down into sobs. "There," said Cecilia, taking her books from her. "Would you like to talk to me about it?" Hermione said nothing, but nodded, looking up at Cecilia with swollen eyes. "Yes," said Cecilia, "all right, come on then. I think a nice pot of tea would do us the world of good." She led Hermione back towards the staff quarters and into the staff room, which was deserted that Saturday evening. The room itself was large and oak-panelled, not dissimilar to Dumbledore's study in appearance. She set Hermione's books down on the table there, and gestured towards a seat nearby. Cecilia waited for Hermione's sobs to become quieter as she busied making some tea. There was an old copper kettle on one of the shelves and she filled it with water from the old cast-iron tap located in the corridor. Attempting to balance the kettle of water over the fire, she noticed that Hermione had stopped crying and was now smiling as she attempted to get the kettle to stay put. "I'll get us some," said Hermione, giggling slightly as Cecilia put down the kettle on the hearth. "I don't think that would have worked anyway, Mrs. Frobisher," she added, as Cecilia sat back down next to her. "Oh, and why's that?" Cecilia inquired, pouring tea from the pot Hermione had produced into 2 cups and handing one to the young witch. "Because that kettle is actually the Ravenclaw house prize. I'm not sure whether Professor Flitwick would have been very happy with you." She smiled again, then glanced down slightly, sipping her tea. "You look a bit happier now, Hermione. Would you like to talk about what's been upsetting you?" She smiled kindly at Hermione. Whatever it was, she had never seen her so distressed, nor many students, even Mole children. It seems a bit silly now, Mrs. Frobisher," she faltered, looking up earnestly at Cecilia. Well, you see. Do you remember when I spoke to you before, about not coming here? When Mum was going to send the letter back to Dumbledore to say no. But you ran up the road to stop her before she posted it, continued Cecilia, nodding. "Yes, I remember you telling me, Hermione." Hermione sighed. "Well, it was just that. Doing this Muggle Studies assignment made me think, perhaps, even after all this, if I don't want to be a witch anymore, if I want to go home and be a normal person again, I wouldn't be able to. Sometimes I just wish I'd stayed at home. I hate that I made my choice 5 years ago without really thinking through the options." She lowered her head, and began to sniff again. "And if I want to go and live in the Muggle world I wouldn't know how to." With the last sentence, Hermione broke out into floods of tears again. Cecilia waited for her to let it all out. "But why would you want to, Hermione?" said Cecilia, when Hermione had composed herself. "Being a witch is who you are. And besides, even if you did want to do that, there's nothing to stop you. You went to junior school, so you know quite a lot of things from Mole's point of view." "I sometimes just don't want to stay here," Hermione went on, seemingly to ignore Cecilia's advice. "And when I try to talk to my friends about it, Harry, well, I can't talk to Harry because of everything he has on, and with Ron, he doesn't understand what I'm talking about." She got to her feet, and Cecilia watched as Hermione paced round the empty staff room. "We had a row," she said, simply. Cecilia said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "And if I can't talk to Ron about how I'm feeling, I can't talk to him about anything." Hermione threw her arms down by her sides as she spoke, and looked at Cecilia. Then it dawned on Cecilia, who nodded slowly. "You like Ron, don't you?" she asked, knowing what the answer would be. Hermione nodded. "Not just like," the girl continued, sitting back next to Cecilia. "I really like him, like that," she said, tilting her head to one side. "But I just can't get him to notice me. He just sees me as Hermione, his and Harry's friend. How am I ever going to get him to notice me if I can't talk to him properly?" Cecilia didn't say anything. This was Hermione's rite of passage from girl to woman. Even if she, Cecilia, had the right answer, it wasn't her place to tell her. Part of growing up as a girl was finding out the answer. Or not. Or realizing it's actually the question that's wrong. "I'm sure he does notice you," said Cecilia, steadily. "Boys are different creatures to us, Hermione, they don't think like we do. I don't know about all this difference people keep banging on about between muggles, squibs and wizards. It's the differences between men and women that are more unfathomable, I think." She smiled, as did Hermione. "Come with me, for a second, I want to show you something." Cecilia opened the door for the staff room and made towards her room. Intrigued, Hermione followed her. She beckoned Hermione inside as she made her way inside, pulling open a couple of drawers of her desk, now beautifully mended by Professor McGonagall. Cecilia pulled out a picture of herself, aged 14. It looked nothing like her now. She was dressed in black though, her favorite color at the time. At the time her friends were into bright colors, spots and stripes. Cecilia had stuck to black. Everything black, jeans, shoes, jacket. All black, except for her hair, which shone out like a sodium streetlight. "Are you aware of what batteries are, Hermione?" she asked, as Hermione surveyed the picture and glanced intermittently at Cecilia. "You put them into things and make them work with electricity," she said. "Why?" "I was your age there, no, perhaps just a bit younger. Mum despaired about my clothes. Even my best friend's nickname for me was Duracell. She waited for the penny to drop." Hermione smiled, and looked up, mischievously. "Now, here I was when I married Tim. 7 years later." She handed Hermione another picture. "Tim was a bit older than me, but he said he remembered me from when I was 14, she said, holding up the first picture. "I remember laughing with my friend Libby when we were at school, saying who we would marry from our friends' brothers. Mine was always Tim. Libby's incidentally was Roger Horden, but he turned out to be well, not boyfriend material. Timothy Charles Frobisher." She sighed, and collected the pictures back off Hermione. "But when I was 14 I never ever thought he knew who I was, let alone would have any interest in me. He remembered my smile, he said, and my hair. About the best bits of me really." Cecilia replaced the pictures back in her drawer. "So you think there might still be hope?" Hermione began to walk nervously around Cecilia's room, glancing in her direction. "I mean, I really do like him." She picked up Cecilia's hairbrush and began to play with it idly. Hermione, it's not my place to say what will happen in the future. Heavens above, sometimes none of us can say what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes. But if he's going to notice you, and chances are he probably already has. Really? Said Hermione, her face brightening. Are you sure? If he's noticed you, Hermione, and the chances are he probably has, she repeated, then he's missing out on something really special. She folded her arms. And that was all the counseling I'm going to do tonight, she thought. Hermione smiled. Thanks, Mrs. Frobisher, for listening. Sorry I was such a silly fool. Not at all, Hermione. We wouldn't be female if we didn't cry our eyes out over boys at least once in our lives. Now, do you feel any better? Hermione nodded, then glanced round Cecilia's room. And you, Mrs. Frobisher? Ah yes, thought Cecilia. The last time Hermione saw me, Professor McGonagall was trying to calm me down after the break-in. Much. I can definitely see the plus side of magic, she said, smiling back at Hermione. Thank you for getting Professor McGonagall for me, Hermione. It was nothing, Mrs. Frobisher. If there are any spells required towards the pursuit of your book, for the sake of your research, of course, then I'd be most happy to oblige. I think I can still remember the one Professor Moody used when he turned Malfoy into a ferret. She grinned, as if sharing a joke with her teacher. Did he? Said Cecilia, who chuckled at the thought as Hermione nodded. Not at present, but you will be the first to know, continued Cecilia. Then a thought struck her. How do you know Draco Malfoy has my book, Hermione? I heard him bragging this afternoon, in the library, with Crabbe and Goyle, just before I had the argument with Ron, she replied earnestly, as if recalling a distant memory. It was odd because he rarely comes into the library, but I think he was telling some third-year Slytherins about it. She continued to look at Cecilia. They also talked about breaking in again tonight, looking for ... some samples I think he said, but then said it didn't matter if they weren't to be found because it was just the book his father wanted tonight, and that his father would be proud of him at last for doing something right. Anyway, that's what I heard, she finished lamely. I was going to let Professor McGonagall know, but now you do, so that's okay. Thank you, Hermione, said Cecilia. You've been most helpful. And now, if you're feeling better, she waited as Hermione nodded in confirmation. There are things I must be getting on with. Have a nice evening. You too, Mrs. Frobisher, said Hermione, on her way out. 88,888,888. Course we will, won't we, Fred? Said George, grinning at his brother. At 8 o'clock you say? It'd be an honor, Mrs. Frobisher, on the lives of MWPP, the founders of mischief and mayhem at this very school. And this, said Fred, handing to her what looked like a tie-dyed velvet curtain, you just throw on, then, Valois. Voila. But are you sure you don't just want us to go and get it for you? It wouldn't take half a mo. George was ready to take the mysterious cloak back off Cecilia. Thanks guys, said Cecilia, nodding slightly in appreciation of the Weasley twins' invaluable help, but I'm sure you understand. This is one score I need to settle on my own. I have your word that none of this will go any further? She had bumped into the twins quite accidentally on her way towards Slytherin House. Cecilia hadn't actually given it a lot of thought about the fact that she was just going to march in there and take mysterious mythology back from Draco Malfoy, but fortunately for her the twins stopped her, and she told them what her intentions were. From there it had been simple. Masters of trick and deception, Fred and George Weasley had outshone their reputations, giving Cecilia everything she needed to undertake a successful recovery operation. She would definitely consider them in the future for any other off-the-record jobs. Do you think we'd go round broadcasting the fact that we deliberately got ourselves into a week's worth of detention?" said Fred, indignantly. "No, Mrs. Frobisher, we solemnly swear we're up to no good, for the sake of Great Britain and all who sail in her," said George, hand across his chest. Fred saluted. Cecilia stifled a giggle, and swallowed, resuming her adult demeanor. "A month's worth of detention would be worth it just to see the look on Malfoy's face when he knows the book's not there," said Fred, looking at George, who nodded in agreement before they both looked at Cecilia. "So, at 8 o'clock, we'll get into a fight with Malfoy and his cronies. You can then put this on and go down to the Slytherin house dorms to get your book back. Then the McGonagall can find us and give us all detention for fighting. He'll look an idiot in front of his dad. And we'll have more than repaid you for the Veritaserum," finished Fred, grabbing hold of the bottom of the cloak, and helped her put it on. For the fact that it looked like a curtain, it felt lightweight, almost feather-light on her shoulders. She looked down. Her body had gone. "Gosh," she gasped. "This is fabulous," and looked up at the twins. "Whose did you say this was?" Fred tapped the side of his nose. "Those that ask no questions, Mrs. Frobisher." "Good mothers never reveal their sources," added George. "If you're going to do it, Mrs. Frobisher, you need to take the second passage off the main corridor, not the first. That was nearly our first mistake when we were last down there. And," added Fred, "make sure the cloak is done up tightly over you," he said, fastening all the buttons around her. "Otherwise bits of you will show, and it'll be a dead giveaway. Oh, and just because you'll be invisible, doesn't mean you're soundproof." The twins chuckled. "Fantastic, lads," said Cecilia. "I don't know however I would have come up with that if it hadn't been for you." As she spoke, the school clock sonorated 8 chimes. Cecilia looked up. "Queen and country," she said, doing up the last button of the invisibility cloak. The twins smirked, and saluted again. Slowly, she made her way down the hall from the fat lady, and up towards the great hall, the twins following at a distance. After about 100 yards, Cecilia glanced over her shoulder to see the twins veer off in the direction of the grand staircase, and waited. Before long, she could hear a commotion, far off, and she knew the twins were putting their side of the plan into action. With any luck that would not only stop Malfoy and Go from returning to their dormitory, but also a good few Slytherin, eager to tell and Professor Who would listen an exaggerated version of how the Weasley twins attacked Draco with no provocation at all. For once they'd be right, and she wasn't sure how many teachers would believe them. Turning left and right, Cecilia wove her way through the maze of corridors that led between the Great Hall and the Slytherin dormitory. The twins had explained that the dormitories were laid out in the same way as in Gryffindor, with the boys and girls separate, to either side, above the common room, but that Draco had a separate room, off the main dormitory, of his own. Cecilia had resisted the urge to ask them how they knew. In addition, where the password-protected portrait of the fat lady was the security for Gryffindor House, Slytherin House relied on a complex network of corridors and stairs, neatly interlinked, with one, and only one route in and out. Any mistake would be terminal, they'd explained. It would be the only mistake she would make, although they didn't elaborate on the type of sticky end she would encounter. After about an hour of map reading, checking the landmarks that the twins had carefully enchanted onto the parchment and dodging out of the way of passing students, Cecilia reached the common room. Trying not to look too hard at the decorations and gruesome symbols decorating the walls, was that really the head of the troll? She wondered in disgust. She made her way up a set of stone stairs towards the boys' dormitory, remembering in time to only tread on every other one, and entering, hoping against hope that no Slytherin boys had chosen this moment to get changed. As dark as the common room had been below, the dormitory was darker, illuminated sporadically with flaming torches. Cecilia waited for her eyes to get used to the light, and idly glanced at the pictures on the wall near the communal cloak pegs. 1985. 1984. 1983. 1982. Cecilia scanned what looked like final year house pictures, with wizards from the new year, all staring out of the iconographs. How odd, she thought, when every other wizard picture was animated, the students in these were fixed. 1981. 1980. 1979. 1978. 1977. 1976. Cecilia carried on scanning the faces, but then stopped, and looked back. 1977. Severus Snape stared back at her. Through the invisibility cloak, she looked at his features. They were soft and youthful, like the boy she had seen in Minerva's memory. He was standing next to other students whose expressions were also somber, not a smile amongst them. But the pictures were animated though. Cecilia could see the trees wave slightly in the background, and the clouds moved across the monochrome sky. She looked back at Severus. It wasn't just a lack of expression on his face though. It looked like he was staring right back at her. As if he was staring right back at her. She corrected herself quickly, right through the cloak and through 20-odd years of time. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a slight metallic tap-tap. She looked round the dormitory quickly, but could see no one. Carefully she headed towards the door opposite now. This had to be where Draco's room was, for there was no other door, and no other before she'd entered. As she made her way across quickly, she nearly jumped out of the invisibility cloak. Tap tap. Tap tap. She looked round. And a bat, upside down in a cage on the opposite room, dropped monkey nut kernels against the bars as it ate. Stupid you, Cecilia Jane, she scolded herself as she reached the door. Not like you to get spooked by pets. Carefully, she opened the door into a slightly brighter lit corridor. Glancing round again, she noticed another door with a plague attached to it. Head boy. Well, that can't be Draco's room, thought Cecilia, frowning. He's not head boy of Slytherin. But there were no other doors in sight, and other than start going through the belongings of every boy in the house next door, she must put her trust in the twins. They hadn't let her down so far. The room was almost pitch black, save for sconces fixed to the wall in the shape of skulls. Those were the first things Cecilia noticed about the room. The second was the huge mirror behind the door and over a huge dressing table that illuminated the weak light eerily from the skulls, making the room seem much larger. Once she had got over these features, the rest of the room seemed, well, not too bad. Like a typical boy's room, she thought. A typical teenager. Books lay scattered around the floor with clothing and other belongings. A magazine about brooms and Quidditch lay open on a chair beside his unmade bed. At the other side of the room there was a wash area, a sink, skull-shaped, with a pedestal was mounted to it, and beside was a door which was ajar, and seemed to lead to a small toilet. It wasn't hard to see where he'd found the inspiration for the total mess she had found yesterday. Cecilia continued to look round, though she didn't want to look too hard. Draco Malfoy may be a little rat, but there were some things she didn't want to know about. Thank you very much. Where to start, she wondered, looking at the melee. Randomly she turned over books in case they were, taking care to replace them where she found them. I could really have done with Hermione, actually, thought Cecilia, as she looked again. Half an hour later, having carefully looked through everything she dared, and jumped at every sound she'd unintentionally made, she felt she was near to conceding defeat. She had, however, found a gold bangle of hers she thought she'd lost at the start of term. Her first Christmas present off Tim, where he'd gone out and had her date of birth engraved on. Wrongly, but no book. Sighing, Cecilia turned to go. She really had thought she'd be able to get it back. As she was about to walk back through the door, she paused, looking across at the hundreds of items, combs, watches, a signet ring ... all swathing the table. But what had caused her to stop was a picture. More precisely, what the picture was standing on. Maybe it had been the light, thought Cecilia, as she pulled off the silk cloth that covered mysterious mythology, or that it had been hidden in plain sight for a reason. Whatever, it didn't matter, she'd got Remus's book back. Cecilia stowed it away inside the invisibility cloak. The twins had shown her that the pockets were endless. They could hold anything and everything, which had meant, they'd added, that it could hold Honeyduke's finest. Looking for a book of a similar size to she picked up a copy of Hogwarts, a history, which she'd inadvertently kicked across the floor earlier, and replaced the picture, turning to go for a second time, across the Slytherin boys' dorm, down into the common room, through the maze of corridors and freedom. But it wasn't to be quite yet. Cecilia had noticed the woman in the picture. She was thin and sculpted, not unlike the pictures she had seen at Grimmauld Place. She too, was almost immobile against the faintly flapping background against which the iconograph had been taken. The look on her face had made her not unattractive features ugly. It was as if she were a bird of prey, scanning a cornfield looking for a mouse. A look would have turned milk sour, thought Cecilia, grimly. The woman, she noticed, was glancing down at her hand holding the frame, so she moved it, and held it at the top. But the woman was still looking down. Underneath a pot of Brylcreem and a flannel, black with skulls, was an open book. Was this what the woman was looking at? Carefully, she scanned the page. The date, October 12th, was visible at the top, and beneath, in Draco's neat, copperplate writing, read: "If this doesn't make Father proud of me, and in turn, the Dark Lord of him, then nothing will." Crabbe, the idiot of the house, actually used his tiny mind for once and came up with a charm to break into the Squibs' room. It might have been quicker, however, to have found our wretched ex-house elf. However, we managed it. And how much fun did we have? She does have some peculiar stuff, including some brightly colored camisoles. They went through my underwear, thought Cecilia in disgust. But best of all was the destruction of all things mole. Hades knows where the foul thing gets it all from. There's no power in moles, that's for sure. Father said she can't have been a squib from the wizard community like Professor Snape said to us if she has all this stuff. So when I get her again, I'll make her tell me. At this point the writing stopped. Cecilia looked over the page for more, but Draco had clearly not filled in anything for today. So, thought Cecilia, Severus told them she was a squib. That certainly explained a few things. But why? Quickly, she looked through the book, which was clearly a diary. At the front, the year started with January 1st, but not many pages had been filled in, and it appeared to Cecilia he only recorded events that he found important. She turned to the front cover. The Diary of Malfoy, she read, volume 137, D. Malfoy. 1996. How tacky, thought Cecilia, as she looked at the frontispiece. How ghastly to have your own diary as part of a family tome. Family must be really important to him then if he's willing to share his private thoughts with the rest of them. The title page was most impressive. The Malfoy coat of arms at the center, a huge beast adorned with gold and silver, skulls adorning the beast as it stood proudly from the sable background, and below it, in Latin, a motto, Cur in Potentia. Blood and power? Thought Cecilia, turning over the page. Power of the blood? What sort of family motto was that? Not one that could be explained by the information overleaf. However, the creator of the motto, and author of the family tree, a one Joseph Black, 1728 to 1799, had been honorable and faithful to the pure blood of wizards. henceforth setting down a true and accurate account of the family history beginning this year 1801. Cecilia looked a couple of pages on in the tiny, seemingly endless script so as to raise the power and might of the family, proud and noble, unsullied, forever. Not thinking now, Cecilia looked across at the Malfoy, or indeed Black, family tree. Each family member sat close to one another, a picture of each above their names and respective birth and death dates. The pictures from earlier appeared to be hand-colored line drawings, with iconographs replacing them around the middle of the 1800s. The names too, began to develop, becoming more flamboyant and exotic as the generations passed. Right at the top was Joseph Black, who looked beadily at her from his miniature as she traced her finger over the page, following the lines wizards that made up Draco's family. Every so often she would come across a dead end, presumably where a witch or wizard had expired or fallen out of favor with the patriarch. Later still, names had not been eliminated, merely crossed through in red, occasionally with a word or two of explanation. One set of twins, for example, had the word squib written above. Shame indeed in this family, thought Cecilia grimly. As she reached the bottom, coming now towards the middle of the 20th century, Cecilia was amazed to find the lines joining back with each other, as if fewer and fewer pure-blood wizards could be found, and intermarriage had to suffice. Looking around Draco's name, she noticed another name she recognized, that of Nymphadora, though her surname was not recorded, and that of her mother Andromeda, connected to that of Draco's mother Narcissa, and another name, Bellatrix. Above Andromeda's name, in red, were the words, married, T-Tunks, misborn. What on earth does that mean, thought Cecilia, puzzled not for the first time that evening. As scanned the vicinity again she saw another name in tiny script, almost hidden in the corner, Sirius Black. Cecilia looked again. Yes, indeed, the name Sirius Black, she read. The name had been crossed through in red. But this couldn't be the Sirius Black she knew. This Sirius Black had died, according to the legend, in 1972, aged 13. She looked at the picture. No, it was him. The same hair, the same twinkle in his eyes. So what was his year of death recorded for then, when he was very much alive? Adjacent to Sirius's entry was that of a Regulus Black. He was very much a part of the family, though, no red line for him. Just as Cecilia was about to turn the page, she stopped. The diary of Draco Malfoy was fascinating, she thought, but she still needed to get out of here. Placing the book down on the desk, she opened the diary back to 12th October. Something fluttered from between one of the pages. She read the entry through again. So, thought Cecilia, a proud and noble pure-blood, are we? She thought, looking down at the diary page. A little sneak and thug is what you really are, she thought, picking up Draco's monogrammed hairbrush from the dressing table. You really think a lot of yourselves, don't you? Thought Cecilia, as she teased a blonde strand of hair out of the bristles. There, thought Cecilia happily as the balance of power shifted back towards her. Let's see what I can do with this, with my lack of power. Pleased at the revenge she would be able to enact, as well as at the retrieval of Remus's book, Cecilia made to go. Hand on the knob. She was just about to turn it when she noticed the picture which had fallen out of Draco's diary. As she picked it up to slot it back in, her stomach lurched and Cecilia recalled the day she sat in Gringotts, nervously waiting for the decision about her legitimacy in the wizarding world. Those pale, cold eyes and white blonde hair. The man who had asked her what she was doing at Hogwarts. Where his son went. The man. That man who gave her the Slytherin book. A Death Eater, loyal to Voldemort. Draco Malfoy's father. Cecilia was about to turn to the diary again to investigate this shocking discovery when she registered footsteps and voices growing louder in her consciousness. Frozen to the spot, Cecilia waited for the inevitable arrival of Malfoy and company. The door opened, and she heard voices. She closed her eyes. The door closed as she heard Malfoy say, "In fact, no. I think we should go and have supper first. Those wretched Weasleys have just about ruined the evening. Detention for a week. I'm going to get them, Goyle, if it's the last thing I do." She did not know how long she stood there after the voices and footsteps died away, but Cecilia didn't have the courage to move until her heartbeat had slowed so it didn't sound as if it was coming out through her ears. Pulse still racing, and mysterious mythology gripped tightly in her hands, Cecilia finally turned the handle and slipped out.